She's a professor of lifespan development in the psychology department at NC State. Her work examines the connection between stress and various indicators of health in daily life. This is Dr. Shevaun Neupert.
Stress. We know it's not great. It's not good for many indicators of our health and our functioning. So the primary goal of my research program is to try to find the factors that disrupt that connection between stress and our health. So what are the things that we can identify that might help people have better responses to stress when it does happen? So one of the guiding principles of my work is that people are different. Differences between people really matter. You could think of personality differences, stages in life differences. Those are important things for how we experience stress and how we respond to them. But what's also really important are the kinds of days that people have. Not all of our days are the same. So if we look at these emojis, the person on the left, who looks pretty happy, also has days of sadness. And the person on the far right, who looks kind of sad, also has days of joy. So it's really important, these principles that drive my work, is that we acknowledge that people are different, but that also we have changing daily contexts and the events that we experience, and that our health can change and fluctuate daily. So the way that we try to capture these differences is by asking our research participants, who we love, they are wonderful, every day to answer surveys and questionnaires for a series of many consecutive days, sometimes up to 45 days. We ask them all these questions about their health, their well-being, the kinds of events they experience. And so when I'm thinking about these events, these stressors that our participants report, they might seem on the surface to be somewhat minor. They might crop up in daily life and then they go away. But the effect of these stressors are really powerful predictors of our daily health and functioning. So they might be things like arguments or disagreements, work-related stressors, things that happen at home, things that happen to people that we care about in our social network that turn out to be stressful for us, or things that happen with our personal health. And so because we're asking our participants to report on the exposure to these stressors every day, we get some really interesting responses. So people will ask them, did anything stressful happen at work today? And I want to share with you an example of a participant who said, yes, here's what happened to me at work today. I ran out of something at work, some pop, 7-Up. They were late in bringing it, so it was stressful. Just not being able to provide it is stressful. During lunchtime, and don't like being without it, it's important. Want people to have a choice. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, is she really telling us a stressor about 7-Up? Yes. Hang on, let me tell you why. This is where I get to cite Tina Fey. She's hilarious on purpose. This is her graphic. You can see on the vertical axis the daily stress level of various jobs. Clearly not to scale. It's meant to be funny, right? So on the left, writing for SNL, and then acting on SNL, which apparently is significantly less stressful than her 30 Rock writing job. And then we see coal mining in the US, and then coal mining in Chile, being a baby, business guys who do stuff with money, I really don't know, active military service, and managing a Chili's on a Friday night, right? So this is where we come back to the 7-Up. This person who is a manager of a restaurant, right, is out of something that customers want. So Tina Fey helps us understand, right, that who you are matters, and the kinds of days that you have also matter for your exposure and your response to stress. So I want to share with you some of the ways in which we quantify these responses to stress in my work. So in this example, we're looking on the vertical axis of daily psychological distress. This is an indicator of emotional functioning. A higher score indicates that someone is just not doing emotionally well. They're in a distressed state. And so we're looking at different people, so whether or not people feel like they have a low amount of control over their life or a relatively high amount of control over their life. So that's a difference left to right in this figure. And then we're also looking at different kinds of days that people report, whether or not they've had an argument or an interpersonal tension on the day. And the slope of these lines quantify their emotional response to the stressor. So we're looking at the change between days when they don't have an argument compared to days when that same participant does have an argument. And if we look on the left side, we see for people who feel like they don't have a lot of control in their lives, when they have arguments, especially if they're young people, they have the steepest emotional consequence to those arguments. So it's the younger people who are doing the worst when they don't have control in terms of their emotional response to arguments. If we look on the right side of the figure, the people who feel like they have quite a bit of control in their lives, that's great for people of all age groups. Those reactivity slopes, those slopes are all quite low. So they're having the best possible response to those arguments. In this figure, we're looking at predicting the number of memory failures that people report on a daily basis. So things that you might forget a word on the tip of your tongue, you know what it is, you can't quite find it, or forgetting a medication. In this study, we looked exclusively at a sample of older adults, and so we asked them to report the things they forgot each day. And then we looked at the difference in how they might respond to arguments in their lives based on personality. So we see here in this red line, people who are high in neuroticism had more memory failures, they forgot more things, but they also forgot even more things when they had arguments with people. And that's in contrast to people who were lower in neuroticism. They didn't have quite as many cognitive reactions to these stressors in their lives. So I focused on stress and how it can be bad for health. In my lab, we also are really trying to understand what people can do before stress happens. Are there things that we can do, actions we can try to take before stress happens to mitigate some of its consequences? So proactive coping might be something like trying to make a plan. It might be trying to solve a small problem before it turns into a large problem. And in this final figure I want to show you, we're looking at the physical consequences of stress. So a higher score here is a number or an increased number of physical symptoms that people are reporting each day. And so we see on the left side, the people who aren't, the younger adults are on the left side, and we see the red line are the younger adults who aren't doing much proactive coping. They're not trying to make plans. They're not trying to solve the small problems. They have the strongest physical consequence when they're exposed to stressors. So I want to leave you with 3 thoughts. It is normal to feel worse after stress. But who you are and the kinds of days that you have are really important for how you experience that stress and the consequences of it once it does happen. And when we think about coping or trying to manage the stress in our lives, you can imagine trying to find a solution that fits the problem. That's a good thing to think of. It might involve reaching into some sort of toolbox where you've built coping tools or strategies throughout your life. It can get easier as we have more experiences to understand what works in situations and what doesn't. Sometimes people around us help us to develop those coping tools. And this kind of process of trying to select and keep at it, try to solve the stress, is really useful because it can help mitigate our negative consequences to stressors. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions for Dr. Neupert? Your stress can fade away. Go back here.
Thank you for your talk. Can you define the age range for young, middle, and old?
In that study, thanks for that question. This was based on the National Study of Daily Experiences, so it's adults aged 25 to 74 from all 50 states in the US. And so the younger people in that study were from 25 to 39, middle-aged people were 40 to 59, and then older people were 50 plus.
Another question here.
On a similar theme, how do you quantify the participants' neuroticism?
We have an inventory. There's many ways of doing this. One of the way in which we did it in that particular study, this was done with veterans who are in the normative aging study. So they were recruited in the Boston area starting in the 1960s. And so we've been following them for decades. And there's an inventory called the EpiQN. I would love to go into more details if you're interested, but it's a 9-item questionnaire that assesses people's own perceptions of the volatility of their emotions, their hesitance, or their tendency to maybe dwell on more negative things. So it's a self-report indicator, but it's been used widely in many studies. So it's a personality inventory. Good question.
Hi, I'm interested in hearing more. Was any research done on the type of coping strategies? For example, coping mechanism could be drink wine or beer like we've done here, but that's not necessarily going to improve your memory. Were there certain things that were actually helpful in that aspect?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the last slide I showed with proactive coping, these tend to be more traits that people have, like their general orientation to like making plans, to think ahead to the future, to try to scan their environment, to reduce their exposure to stressors. So part of it is vigilance in one's own environment and being an expert in one's environment and knowing what to expect when. Another aspect is being aware when a problem does start, that it would be useful to invest some resources to try to stop it right there rather than to let it get larger. So that's an example here. If I have more time, I can also talk about, there's anticipatory coping, which you can use for specific stressors that you know are coming up. Tomorrow I have this huge work deadline. I'm going to come up with a plan in my head of what I'm going to say, and then what is the other person going to say? And if that doesn't work, I'm going to go this way, right? So you can almost think about it as rehearsing something in your head. So that's another possible strategy.
Hi. Can you define first neurotism? And then secondly, how would you apply this, say, in the community when you're dealing with areas that have a lot of stress because of social determinants of health?
Yeah, so neuroticism is a personality trait that tends to be defined as a lot of negativity and a lot of volatility around emotions. So there's a lot of negative emotions that tend to be arrived at quickly. So it doesn't take much to trigger a negative emotion, in that instance. If you're highly neurotic, it doesn't take much, So there's something called the kindling effect, this idea that it might just take a little spark to start a big fire. So that's where that would come from. And so I think your question about social determinants of health is really important as well, right? If we think about the resources that people bring to be able to cope with stressors, those resources are not necessarily distributed evenly. And so that's a big area that's really important as well.
I have two questions. Under stress now, my blood pressure, I believe, has been raised as high.
Yeah.
Is blood pressure one indicator in your study? Secondly, how can we cope with what is your advice?
How can we cope with?
The high pressure.
High blood pressure, Yeah, so there's lots of cardiovascular effects of stress, certainly. So we have looked at blood pressure in some of my studies. Interestingly, there are some short-term benefits of raised blood pressure when we think about people trying to put forth effort in doing mentally challenging things. It's natural for your blood pressure to rise when you're exerting a lot of mental energy. But sustained high blood pressure, of course, is a different issue. And so there can be medications if that's important. Physical exercise is one of the great tools that people can use to try to combat the physical effects of stress, assuming that that's something that fits with their interests and abilities and interests, I guess. So yes, we've looked at blood pressure. We also have looked at cortisol in my lab as well. So we look at other physiological mechanisms where we can pick up on stress. We've taken participants' hair. You can look at the first 3 centimeters of growth from the scalp, and you can see how much stress a person has been under without asking them any questions at all. So we've looked at hair. You can look at spit. You can look at blood. So there's lots of ways that we can try to see how much stress you've been under.
I'm in the back now. We're going to go over here.
What positive responses to stress have you identified?
Yeah, in the short run, there can be some positive aspects of stress. So people have talked about in the short term, if you're under moments of stress, you might be able to remember things in that moment better than if the stress had not been there. In my work, when we're looking at things that happen on a day-to-day basis, we tend to see things that might carry an influence of more than 24 hours. So we can look at something that happens to a person on a Monday and then try to pick up some health consequences on Tuesday. And we do the same thing. We look what happens on Tuesday and follow up with health consequences on Wednesday. But I think your question is really interesting because it probably needs a shorter time window. It probably needs on Monday at noon, you had this stressor. What happened to you at 12 and 30 seconds. So I think we need a more fine-grained kind of assessment to pick up on those benefits that you're asking about.
Thank you, Dr. Neupert, very much.
Thank you.
Great questions.